So I'm going to skip over Range Explorer here. I'm going to go through these buttons. I'm going to skip over Range Explorer here for a second. And there's a good reason for that because, quite frankly, Range Explorer is, I could spend an entire video on Range Explorer. There's a lot of information that we can go through with Range Explorer. I'm also going to skip here over Strategy plus EV because I think this is actually ordered a little poorly. And I'm going to start with Strategy. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but the Strategy section is really what visualizes the output of a PioSolver, and it's what visualizes the strategic frequencies. We've seen the metrics of each combination, but this is really what visualizes how our range diverge or are split into various strategic decisions. This can be an output of the solver, as in this case, where the solver reaches this as an equilibrium range split as this point of context in the overall game tree that we've built. But it can also be an input, as we'll see when we dive into node locking. We can fix one of these nodes with particular decisions and rerun the solver. And those tests are essential for developing quite powerful strategies here. The shading is broken down according to the color palette on the right-hand side of the screen that we have right here too. So, this is going to look all green because we're checking virtually all of our range. So I'll check the range here, but you can start seeing now each of these individual boxes are shaded at a little bit of a more granular level than the macro versions that are shaded here too. The amount that it's shaded horizontally in this case is proportional to its overall composition. So, and we can see the numeric breakdown between the options here at the range, at the hand, at the combination level. So we've already kind of gone through the shading breakdown and the strategic action split for at the macro level. We can drill into the hand level. So suppose we want to understand, we have top set. What does top set do on this board? Well, we can now look and see that, at equilibrium, the solver is betting large just under 20% of the time. We're betting small in this case here, just over 80% of the time, and not checking. And, that's also visualized by the shading here. There's just about 20% of this box here horizontally is shaded darker, which represents this larger bet size. And most of the box is shaded lighter, which represents the smaller bet size. We have other combinations in range, such as ace-7 suited, which tends to choose a larger bet size. Ace-6 suited that tends to choose a larger bet size, which is fairly interesting actually, in the sense that we're picking these types of hands to include in our larger bet size range construction. Now we can do a lot of visual exploration here and insight development, and sometimes it's easier to miss patterns in numbers unless we've kind of really built some specific reporting to identify them. But when looking through a solve, we may start to see different types of hands get put into different strategy lines visually. And there's a lot of learning that we can access here by essentially just visually looking at how different hands and also these combinations, right? We can see how these combinations are constructed. We can visually see how these hands are at equilibrium, broken up into some of the different strategic frequencies, and turn those into some insights, especially when we start seeing some similar patterns occur again and again. And that's a learning. And if you can access that at the right spot at the poker table, or even better, if you can turn that into some type of heuristic that you can integrate into your strategy, you're going to become a better player. Now I'm going to move back up to expectation value. So the one thing I'll note here is, as we're looking through this, all of these numbers, what this represents is the breakdown of how frequently the solver puts this hand into each of these options at equilibrium. If I click the strategy plus EV, the shading values stay the same, and the only thing that really changes here is the numbers. And the numbers now show the expectation value for each one of these options. So, again, looking at our Kings example here, you're going to see that the larger bet size is earning an EV of 144.18. The smaller bet size is earning an EV of 144.42. And the check is somewhat a little bit lower at 140.72. Now, some of these numbers look, somewhat paradoxical. It can be confusing when you first see like expectation values that are the same for multiple options. I've actually seen some people that are somewhat turned off to solvers, and especially turned off to these types of analyses, and take a reaction of, well, betting and checking are the same, so it really doesn't matter what I do here. Well, as I mentioned in the misconceptions in module number 1, that's a somewhat false interpretation of this point. And, again, don't worry about the specifics of that now. We'll get into examples that demonstrate this, but what it is important to understand is that all of these values are in context of the overall range composition. So yes, at this point, betting and checking here, or in this case here, betting large and betting small, they are equal in expectation value for that particular hand. But that is only the case for this exact split of these two hands, if we kind of do this at an 80-20 mix, and the exact weighting of every single other combination as a portion of your overall range. Meaning, if I just said, okay, well, it doesn't matter what I do if I, just remove this large bet from my range, or if I remove the small bet from my range, or whatever it really, I kind of just choose one of the options somewhat randomly. That's going to ultimately change my overall frequencies, and it does open up the door and lets my opponent play some exploitative strategies, whether it be willingly or unwillingly, that can take advantage of that. And if they could do that effectively or accidentally, then my expectation value would actually decrease with that particular choice. So again, as we kind of work through the course, we're going to talk through considerations about how do we actually combat that, and how do we account for that throughout the course. This next button here is strategy and react, and this can look somewhat intimidating, but I think this is a really cool way to process a decision point beyond the current point. So I'm going to go back to the root here, and we'll kind of have this strategy plus react here to kind of go through this example. When splitting into our decisions, it's helpful to have a sense of our opponent's range and how we think it's likely that they're going to react. And this button here helps us break down the range into that next decision point on the street. So we can see here at the root, the top part here, this is kind of broken up into a top and a bottom. And I'll actually kind of start at the higher level. We have two separate rows here. The top portion of this is representing our current decision to bet or check. And as we know already, the out of position player here is checking with all of range on the flop. So the whole top portion of our macro part of the range, as well as virtually all of these hands, the top half of all of these boxes is going to be green because we're checking everything here. And the bottom part, what that's going to do is that is going to visualize how at equilibrium this out of position player would respond if our opponent had an aggressive response. Now we can see that if we check and our opponent bets, well, now we're going to, in the macro level, be raising a portion of the time. We're going to be calling a portion of the time, and we're going to be folding a portion of the time at equilibrium. And we also can see at each of these individual combos, they're going to have some frequency of raise, call, and fold. Also, I really love how the macro level breaks this up into all of these different options. So it can show us how often we're bet raising, how often we're bet calling, how often we're bet folding. And we obviously know we're checking everything here, but now it also breaks up into how often we're check raising, how often we're check calling, and how often we're check folding. To me, I think this is an awesome way to teach and visualize range construction. So when trying to improve in building out ranges within an overall strategy, being able to see how a bet range would break up into bet continue or bet fold is a great way to look at things. Being able to see how a check range will continue into check calls, check raises, check folds is a great way to kind of visualize and picture, well, what do we do if our opponent responds like this? Or what do we do if our opponent bets? It can be very, very insightful, and I think this visualization makes that analysis much, much, much easier. Finally, the compare actions button. It looks at the difference between various lines. And it calculates the difference and displays that magnitude graphically. Based on my comment earlier, I think you can probably guess that I really don't spend a ton of time using this feature. So while this can be helpful for identifying, what it can be helpful, I guess I should say, is for identifying huge differences. But as I mentioned, really the close ones, we just really reached an equilibrium point, or we've gotten close to an equilibrium point where a portion of that overall combination was allocated into each particular strategic frequency part of the range to weigh out the overall composition, which would, in my opinion, a lot of it would ultimately zero out if we solved it to an actual equilibrium. But instead we have just a little bit of margin of error, which is why kind of there's some nominal value to them. But the bigger differences mean that one option is significantly better or worse than the other in the context of this game tree. So, when you see that in this example, you can start there when purely choosing one option to take over another. So, this is where I might, specifically look at, certain hands here and say, if I do see some green shading, that's when I know that one option is likely going to be much better than the other if I'm looking at the tree this way. There are 4 buttons here below, and all of them are helpful in their own ways to visualize things a little bit differently. There's first this refresh on new selection button, and that changes the viewer as we move forward and backward in the tree. I keep this checked by default as I want to navigate the tree. I want to navigate it quickly and see what I scroll to. But if you want to keep a certain view up and make some changes on the screen or navigate to different portions of the tree without necessarily changing the rest of the tree, you can uncheck this. So, as you can see, I can kind of uncheck this and click check and bet, and I can navigate through the tree, and you'll see the rest of this tree doesn't change. Then when I kind of check it again and I move myself back, and now I start moving to different portions of the tree, and now you will see the game tree change a little bit here too. So, again, I like to keep this refreshed. I like to keep this checked. I think whenever I move to different parts of the game tree, I tend to want to see the rest of the screen respond that way. I also believe it's also checked by default, but again, it's good to know that that option is there if you do want to uncheck that. The next one is square size proportional to weight. I think it's a really awesome button, but it can play tricks with your mind if you don't know it's clicked. You'll see in this range that it is clicked. Not all of the heights of these boxes are the full height of the box, and some of them are even quite small. And that's because we don't necessarily have 100% of all of these combos in the starting range. We've seen the starting ranges, and we can actually even see it right now if we look through the range of the out-of-position player here. Some of these ranges only have a portion of the overall values of the range, right? So, and we can see that. And I'm actually going to keep this view clicked as we show this. But all of these values are proportional from a height perspective. So this 27.4%, it's highlighted yellow. Only 27.4% of this box is actually highlighted. This one's close to 50%. It's 48%. So virtually just about half of this box is highlighted here, and it's somewhat proportional. I think that this view is quite helpful, and keeping it like this is somewhat helpful because it allows you to truly visualize and understand the overall composition of your range. Oftentimes, I think it's important to have an idea of the overall quantity or density of a particular hand type that we have in our overall range. So by visualizing it this way, it's a way that we can just display another data point. It's a way in which we can see the relative number of combinations that we have of a particular hand as it relates to the rest of our overall range. But when values are small, sometimes it's a little hard to see the other things that we're actually trying to study, which is how much of that particular hand is put into a strategic action. So we can uncheck this, and what you'll see here is now the square size does not become proportional to our overall weight, and all of these boxes end up being full. And you could even see this more so when we look through strategy. It just fills the entire boxes. So I'll check this again and then uncheck it and show you that now we don't visually see what proportion of that hand is actually within the overall composition of the range. Again, I don't necessarily recommend that you keep this unchecked. I do recommend you keep this on by default because I think it can be very easy to accidentally interpret this wrongly if it's unchecked because you didn't necessarily fully understand the range composition. But to get a quick sense, especially as a toggle around, which hands are being slotted into which strategic frequencies, I think this is a pretty good option here. The next two we're going to go through somewhat quickly. Normalized squares, it's purely for visual purposes. The way this checkbox works is the most frequent combination of a range gets a weight of 1, and then all other combinations get scaled proportionally according to what the combination that was weighted as 1 was multiplied by. It's per combo, it's not per hand group. Again, it's purely for visual purposes, doesn't change any of the data. I'll show you kind of an example of this, and it really doesn't happen until it doesn't make a lot of visual sense until we get to later in the game tree. Again, even still, I'm clicking through this right now, and there's not a lot that's ultimately changing in the game tree here. Yeah, so there we go. So you're starting to see a little bit, and it's normalizing this 9-5 suited to 1, and then it proportionally weights everyone else according to that same ratio. It's useful when we get deep into the game tree, when we get down to this point where there's not a lot of combinations in range, right? Like this is a part of the game tree we don't necessarily reach very often. I don't really use the normalized squares button super often. It makes sense when we get late in game trees and no combination necessarily has a large enough value to be visible, but it's not necessarily something that I use super often. Last one here is bars width proportional to weight. This actually does change the values within the cell. So if this is chosen, the specific combinations will share the space in the square proportionally to how often they are in a current range. I do like to keep this checked, as I feel this is an overall better representation of what our range is doing on a weighted average basis. But again, this works out to be more useful later on in the game tree when we get to the point where you can kind of start seeing numbers change. So visually things aren't changing as much, but some of the data points will change a little bit by actually clicking on this. So I actually do like to keep this checked here because it does keep these values proportional to the actual weight of the overall combinations there. Finally, the last thing I'll go through before I jump back into the Range Explorer here is the suits. So there's suits here on the left-hand side of the screen. The suits are a really cool way to filter the viewer. So it's a cool way to quickly visualize how a particular portion of the range performs. And the top suit represents the first card, and the bottom suit represents the second card. So I can click on any one of these. So let me say I click on just clubs, and now I can just see how all of my club hands perform. And again, we kind of saw an example of this in the input section here, but it allows me to quickly look at the overall range, and we can see how any hands with my suited club hands are performing, and really what my club hands should be doing. So if I just happen to just use my club example here, I can quickly say, and what are the club portion of my overall range doing. If I wanted to look at spades, I can see what is my spade portion of my range doing, etc. We'll go through some of this, and you'll see some of these examples as we work through the modules. Finally, we're going to open up the Range Explorer. And as I mentioned, I could probably spend an entire video going through the Range Explorer, and I'll be using the Range Explorer a lot throughout the course of the Solver Masterclass. The Range Explorer, when I do click it and it opened up a new box, which I will open up right here, and we'll make this full screen. It opens up this completely different interface that packs in a ton of information. And because it has so much information, I'm treating it separately as its own entity. It's the functionality that honestly I use the most within the software. I think it's awesome, and I think there's a lot of really cool information that's in there. This part of the software lets you understand more about the range interactions and get some cool insights that you can then turn into action at the tables. The top of the Range Explorer repeats a lot of the information that we just went through. So, we have checkboxes that we can update on the new node selection. We can make square sizes proportional. We can normalize squares. We can make the bars width proportional, etc. They all do the same exact things that they did in the previous screens. There's other options on here. So, again, we can select new boards. We can click into each of the in position and out of position players' ranges. So, we can look at the out of position players' range, the in position players' range, and, just understand a little bit more about the overarching ranges in these particular spots. We can filter things by suits, and there's various ways in which we can actually manipulate the data here. The biggest value I actually think of this screen here is on the right-hand side of the screen. First and foremost, this gives you another way to aggregate data. So, we've touched on in Module 1, we have the range level, we have the hand level, we have the combination level, but above the hand level and below the range level, we have this hands class level. And I love rolling things up to the hand class level because looking at things at the overall range level, it's great sometimes. It's great to look at your range's incentives and try to determine what your overall range wants to do. But there's not enough nuance sometimes to really connect to strategy action at the table. Whereas at the same time, if we work our way down straight into hand levels, sometimes that can get a little bit too granular and too detailed, and it becomes too difficult to come up with some detailed strategies that we can execute at the table. And that's where this hand class level comes into play. It's kind of that middle layer here where it's somewhat more detailed than the range level, but not quite as detailed as the hand level, which really gives us a better sense of actionability versus kind of somewhat macro level. It also is somewhat broken out by easy to remember heuristics. So it's pretty easy to remember, well, what do my sets do? What do my two pairs do? What do my over pairs do? What do my top pairs do? It's really easy to break things out because these are somewhat high level heuristics that we can start connecting to the way in which we might be thinking about a hand in game. So you'll notice here that this very nicely here breaks down our overall range. So the in position player here, and that's what we're looking at here, is our in position player's range here in this spot. We can see from the most valuable hands in the in position player's range all the way down to the least valuable hands in our in position player range. The solver will break down how a range is constructed by each of these different hand categorizations. The most valuable hands up top, like sets and two pairs and over pairs and top pairs, all the way down to the bottom hands like ace highs and nothing. Pio is going to show all of that info, breaking down our range and our range composition into various sets of value. You can interact with these characteristics as well too. So let's say I click on sets. Well, now the solver is going to show all of the sets in my range. And you'll notice here that it's actually each one of these hands here, it's showing, it looks like there's only half. We have half of fives, half of nines, half of kings. That's by design here because the king of hearts is on the board here in this spot. The 9 of diamonds is on the board here in this spot. The 5 of clubs is on the board in this spot. So while there are 6 ways to make pocket pairs, once one of those cards on the board, there's actually only 3 ways in which we can actually make a set. So, but we can click on any of these here, and what this will do is just highlight that particular portion of our overall range, which is, again, a great way to look at a particular hand class, how it behaves, its overall equity, its expectation value, and any other characteristics that can help us add into our overall strategy construction. If I want to remove this, I can just click out, and now it brings me back to the overarching range. Again, really cool visualization here that we can, and it's color coded the same way that our equity and our EVs are color coded. Right now, this is broken out by equity, but if I want to look at this from an EV standpoint, you can actually see this by EV. We also have some draws below here too, so there's not a lot of draws on this board. There's gut shots, and that's about it. There's really no other kind of primary draws here on the flop, but I can kind of look at this and say, well, what are all my gut shots? And we can see here all of the gut shots that we have in our overall range. The final thing here I want to cover within this particular box is this bottom visualization, which is just an awesome visualization. It's called an equity graph. I remember when I first saw these, it was in Will Tipton's excellent book, Heads Up, No Limit Hold'em, the book that we covered the equilibrium exercise in Module 1. And when I first saw these visualizations, they blew my mind. They're also pretty prominent in, if you've worked in a tool like Flopzilla, this tool is fairly prominent as well, too. The way to read this graph is that each hand in the in position and out of positions range are ranked in order of equity against the other player's range, from lowest equity on the left all the way to highest equity on the right. It's a great way of visualizing how these two ranges interact. We can see here in red here is the in position player's equity. The right is the out of position player's equity. And we can see from the lowest hands on this spectrum, the hands with the worst equity and how the in position compares against the out of position player, all the way up to the top end where the hands where we have 90+% equity here. It can show different, what I like to call the shape of both players' ranges and where there might be pockets of advantage or disadvantage in either player's range. As we can see here, the in-position player, really kind of has a dominant advantage. For the most part, the in-position player just has an equity advantage throughout the entire range. But you're also, as you work through this, you're going to start seeing some cool patterns here where you might start seeing some, very, very polarized ranges versus condensed ranges. When you do see that, you're going to see situations where you have the top end has a lot of high equity hands and a lot of low equity hands, whereas the other range might have a lot of middle equity hands here. So that beat all of these low equity hands, but lose to all the top equity hands here too. So again, really, really, really great way of seeing how two ranges interact. And, after seeing enough of these, you're going to start understanding where opportunities to derive value exists in different scenarios. You can also use some of these checkboxes here. So the checkboxes, you can potentially show just the out of position player, in position player, or just the out of position player. You can also show the expectation values or the equity realizations. I tend to just keep this on equity. I haven't really done a lot of exploration into EV or EQR and how they compare in this visualization. I also tend to only think for out of position player and in position player, it's really kind of one or the other, it's both. I wouldn't necessarily want to look at one or the other. I think the value of this view is looking at both of them together and how ranges interact, not necessarily just looking at one or looking at the other ones. So, again, explore this Range Explorer. I think there's a lot of really, really cool things that you can do within this Range Explorer. So, I would encourage you to spend a lot of time here in the Range Explorer. And that basically does it for the browser tab. Again, as you can see, there's a lot of information here on the browser tab. We just spent a lot of time going through the browser tab and exploring, all of the things that we can within there. So now that we've worked through the tree building tab and we've worked through the browser tab, this is really where the bulk of the information is. The next couple of videos are going to be some somewhat shorter videos where we're going to briefly go through the pre-flop tab and the tree information tab. And then we're also going to have another somewhat longer video where we go through all of these top file menus and talk through all of the options that are in there as well too. So I'll see you in the next video where we actually go through the pre-flop tab. See you there.